Civic Cocktail talks politics, examining key initiatives on the November ballot. I-1639 seeks changes to gun ownership.
This is not a ban. There are many different ways to approach this kind of thing. We actually think we've done it very responsibly.
I think that there is a misunderstanding that everybody who owns a firearm, the impression is that we're all a bunch of crazy people.
I-1634 would ban local taxes on food and beverages.
There's not been one public initiative to tax what human beings would traditionally call food. There have been proposals to tax soda, and that's what this is about.
This is about having an equitable conversation about making this state more affordable for the most vulnerable people living in this state.
And Initiative 1631 targets some of the state's worst polluters.
It's a chance for us to invest in clean energy jobs. It's a chance for us in Washington State to invest in the health and well-being of future generations.
1631 is so poorly written that we don't know what we get. We don't know how this money will be spent.
It's all coming up on Civic Cocktail.
To a brand new season of Civic Cocktail. I'm Joni Balter, and we are all about politics tonight, all about 3 statewide initiatives on the November ballot: guns, soda, and carbon, in that order. Journalists helping with the questions this evening: Essex Porter of Cairo TV and Natalie Brand from King 5 Television. She is also keeping tabs on social media. First up, the gun safety measure, Initiative 1639. With Zach Silk, co-founder and board chair of the Alliance for Gun Responsibility, speaking for Initiative 1639, and Dave Workman, senior editor of gunmag.com and Liberty Park Press. He opposes this measure. Zach Silk, we start with you. Can you give us the pro-1639 elevator pitch briefly? What would it do, and why do we need it?
Sure. Well, thank you, everybody, for having me, and to City Club and to the Civic Cocktail. It's a real honor to be here. So the most important thing to remember about 1639, it does 3 important things. We call it the Safer Schools, Safer Communities measure. It applies a much higher standard to the purchase and ownership of assault-style rifles. So those are semi-automatic rifles. That standard would include holding you to the same standard to purchase those as we do currently handguns. That means that it raises the age of purchase from 18 to 21, requires you to go through training, and it requires a much more rigorous background check, which is the second piece of the standard. Currently, when you purchase an assault rifle or a semi-automatic rifle, actually, you don't go through a very rigorous background check. It's a quick federal check. It's the same that's applied to other long guns. But that also means that it misses really important data points that might be applied if you had bought a handgun, for example. A handgun in Washington State, you check on a variety of other things that would be important if you wanted to know if somebody had a criminal record that the local police jurisdiction had, mental health records, and other data that local jurisdictions would have when you were trying to purchase. And the final thing that it does is it makes sure that folks safely store their guns. This is one of the most important ways for us to ensure safety in our community. Guns that are not safely stored fall into the wrong hands. They're easily accessed by children. Many of the tragedies we've had in our own community are because guns were accessed by parents that left their guns lying around. Also, we have a very big problem in this community of stolen weapons, and those stolen weapons find their way into criminal hands, and then they're used in criminal activities. So it's a comprehensive set of standards that we're trying to apply here. It absolutely has been a reaction to the lack of progress in the state legislature, and a reaction to what we see as gun crime and gun deaths, both here in Washington State and across the country. We really encourage you to vote yes. It's a responsible measure, and we believe it'll save lives.
Dave Workman, why wouldn't we, for example, want to raise the age of gun ownership to 21?
Well, because the firearms community looks at this, and there's a lot of 18 to 20-year-olds right now who do own those kind of firearms. They've been very responsible with them. They haven't committed any crimes. There's about 15 to 16 million semi-automatic modern sporting rifles, which people call assault weapons, in circulation right now. If there was a real problem with those guns, we'd certainly know about it. The initiative goes beyond just taking action against that kind of a firearm, and includes just about every semi-automatic rifle that's ever been created by defining a semi-automatic assault weapon as just what a semi-automatic rifle does. 22 caliber, a target rifle, the guns that people hunt deer with. Beyond that, one of the main concerns that my readers have is the invasive nature of the application to buy a firearm. There's a provision in the initiative that that requires the person to essentially open up their medical records to local police for examination. That's a problem with a lot of people who have told me that they think it's a HIPAA violation. And I think also the nature of the initiative itself, it covers 30 pages. There's a lot of stuff in there. And I've had it from several different people who are sincerely convinced that it violates the single subject rule for an initiative in Washington State.
We'll get to the legal part of that. Zach, Washington's measure, if it passes, would be one of the toughest gun safety measures in the country. Is Washington State sort of a testing ground for new gun rules?
Yeah, well, I think, listen, there's a couple of things that are going on with how we are approaching this. The most important thing is that we live in a community that wants to live at very high standards and do maximum protection of human life. And we are not trying to restrict gun ownership for those who are law-abiding and can pass a background check, can do the proper training, and to get access to these guns. So this is not a ban. There are many different ways to approach this kind of thing. We actually think we've done it very responsibly. We are designing new legislation and new approaches to be able to give maximum access to responsible gun owners. If they go through these proper channels and these proper processes, they'll be able to get through to own these weapons. It is true, one of the things that we really pride ourselves on is we want to try new things to keep our community safe while being compliant with the Second Amendment and allowing responsible gun owners to own guns. It is unique. It'll be a unique law, and we would hope that other states will be able to follow suit. We also think it's a way for us to get out of this binary, you're either for the Second Amendment or you're against the Second Amendment. This is just absolutely not true. We think we can live in a society where we have high standards for owning guns and that we can reduce deaths.
Dave, so aren't we in essence balancing this sort of well-respected tradition of young folks hunting against the new reality of some younger people shooting other people far too often?
Well, I think you have to separate the people who are shooting other people from the law-abiding young people. When I was in junior high school down in Tacoma, we had a rifle team. When I was in high school in Tacoma, we had a rifle team. Nobody suffered so much as a scratch. Most people who are gun owners are responsible gun owners. And I think that there is a misunderstanding that everybody who owns a firearm, the impression is that we're all a bunch of crazy people that don't take very good care of our guns. And that's not true at all. The problem with a lot of my readers is that they look at this initiative and they say, wait a minute, the government should not be mandating to me what I do in the privacy of my own home. If I store a firearm safely, that's my business. And how are they going to enforce that? You're going to have a police officer knock on your door and just come in and say, hey, I want to see your gun safe. There are problems with that.
I want to get to that, but first I want to ask you, Zach, about expanded background checks. Isn't this more of a broader category of guns that will be checked via state databases? Is that how it works?
Yeah, effectively. I mean, a little 101 on how to buy a gun in Washington State. You go into a dealership, and they're in Washington State. That means that they have a license to deal these weapons. You end up, if you end up buying a handgun, you go through a pretty rigorous process. We've decided in this state to hold handguns to a very high standard. It's part of the reason we do is because they're very deadly weapons, and they're designed to harm or kill people. And so because of that, we want to make sure you meet a high standard. This is about helping these other category of weapons fall under the same standard. Part of what you can imagine is that we not only want to find out about a federal background check, which is to say it checks against the federal databases if you're qualified, but we want to do a local check. That local check is much, much more comprehensive. It does check against what a local sheriff's office might know about you that may not be up into the federal system. It also makes sure that you don't have a protective order against you that would not otherwise be flagged by the federal system. And it is important, it's one of the incredibly important public safety standards we have, that these highly deadly weapons have gone through a much more rigorous check. We want to make sure that these assault rifles go through that same pattern as what happens with handguns.
Dave, a generation of children are afraid to go to school. What is wrong with more careful vetting of gun owners?
Well, maybe the problem with the media sensationalizing this stuff for one reason. Schools are actually pretty safe.
Media good.
Beg your pardon?
Media good.
Well, yeah, it's all our fault. And I think if you look around the country, you'll find that schools are pretty safe places. They are gun-free zones. These kind of things shouldn't happen there, but they have happened in gun-free zones, soft targets. Children shouldn't be afraid to go to school. I was never afraid to go to school, even when I was going to school with a rifle team down there. I was never afraid of that. I guess maybe what we've done is there's been a societal change. People don't understand firearms. People who live in the city, they don't have any experience with them. I didn't grow up that way. I grew up around firearms, and it never really occurred to me that somebody at some point in time would open fire on a schoolyard full of kids. But we deal with them, not penalize all the gun owners in the country.
Natalie Brand.
Still waiting for some audience questions on Twitter, but in the meantime, I have a follow-up question on the enhanced background checks. There's been some debate about how it's worked with your first initiative, 594. So is local law enforcement, state law enforcement, equipped to handle a greater workload now?
You know, it is an issue that we hope to deal with. We have tried to direct more resources to law enforcement by working with the legislature. There's also a provision in this that there'll be a fee that can be assessed so that there could be more money put into law enforcement so that they can make sure that this happens. And then we're always looking for ways to improve the data that is going in. I mean, really, these background checks at the end of the day are only as good as the data that goes into them. We want those systems to be able to talk to one another. We want it to be very easy to put to process these. So we're fully committed to that. We've been working with law enforcement agencies and the state legislature as we've gone on with the implementation of 594, and we'll do the same with this measure.
Audience, if you want to join, please do line up. Essex Porter, I know, has a question.
You know, listening to Zach, you were saying that a lot of the emphasis was on the weapons like the AK-47 assault-style weapon or the AR-15 assault-style weapon. Dave, for you, you were concerned about the other semi-automatic rifles that a lot of boys, a lot of kids grew up with, used for hunting. Would you be more comfortable with this if those type of weapons were not part of the initiative, even if the AR-15, AK-47 style were part of the initiative? Well,
unfortunately, Essex, the horses left the barn. They are covered in this initiative, and we're at a point right now where the language can't be changed. If this becomes law, if the voters approve of it, the definition that encompasses all of these guns is going to become part of state law. So,
but if voters reject this and Zach and his team would have another chance, would you be more supportive if they just focused on the AR-15, AK-47 style weapon?
Well, it'd certainly be nice if they'd come over and sit down and talk to us about it. They didn't this time around. They didn't talk to us about 594 either. And, you know, 594 was, I guess, sold to the public as a way to prevent the kinds of things that happened in Mukilteo and at Cascade Mall up in Burlington, but they didn't. And that 594 was in effect when those two shootings took place. Didn't prevent either one of those guys from committing the crime.
Zach, do you want to answer that?
Here's the thing about the Mukilteo event, that the Mukilteo event is a good example of a loophole in our current system where a very distressed young man was able to walk into a store and buy an assault rifle, semi-automatic assault rifle, and within 24 hours go and kill several children, maim others, And it's because there was no comprehensive background check. He was under 21. And part of the reason that we are doing this is to prevent those tragedies going forward. 594 was designed to be able to catch people who are not qualified to own a gun and make sure that they couldn't go into the black market or the secondary market to buy a weapon. We've now closed that, which pushes people into the legitimate market, as this young man did. But we don't have the kind of system that would have prevented him from buying this gun. And this measure would have prevented him from buying that gun. And I can tell you that the father of one of the victims is the citizen sponsor of this initiative, and he believes deep in his soul that had this been law, it would have prevented that tragedy. It would have been a cooling off period, it would have prevented them from doing it, and had he actually bought a different type of weapon, he would have been able to fire many rounds as quickly as he could, completely untrained, and kill people. I just want to be very clear. These weapons are designed to kill as many people as quickly as possible. That is their pure purpose. There are a few guns that Dave is referencing that absolutely, there are a few people that may use them for shooting purposes or sporting, but the vast majority of these weapons are simply designed to shoot as many rounds as quickly as possible, and they really are designed to kill. And that's why we feel like those should live at the highest possible standard for access, and that's what this would do.
Audience question. Hi, how you doing?
All right. This question is for Mr. Workman. Welcome to Seattle. If by some civic calamity I-1639 actually passes, what can we Americans do to resist, slow walk, or otherwise ignore it until we can repeal it in the legislature?
Well, I suspect that if it does pass, there's probably going to be a series of lawsuits challenging it on some of the grounds that I mentioned earlier. It may be a state lawsuit, maybe a federal lawsuit, maybe a combination of it depends on who files the lawsuit and what their grievance is.
What lawsuit are you anticipating? What lawsuit do you think is most likely?
Well, I think most likely it will probably be a state challenge to begin with.
About?
Excuse me?
About?
Well,
about two subjects or something?
Multiple subjects, and there might even be a 14th Amendment challenge at the federal level, because what you're doing is you're discriminating against a class of citizens that have achieved majority. 18, 19, and 20-year-olds can vote, they can join the military, they can enter into contracts, they can do all kinds of stuff. When they get into the military, we don't give them a semi-automatic rifle. We give them a full auto, and they're responsible for that. This argument that they're not responsible should be taken up with the Marine Corps and the U.S. Army. So we'll see how that works out.
Social media question from
Do you have a Twitter question for Dave? This audience member asked, what responsible gun owner will be negatively impacted by this proposal if law-abiding will get to obtain the weapons?
I think all of us will be impacted in some way by a law. Remember, we're talking about a piece of legislation that is designed to impact a protected constitutional right. And we need to understand that when your rights are...
If they pass the background check.
If they pass a background check, they ought to be able to own a firearm. But how many background checks do you need to go through? How much time do you have to wait before you can exercise a constitutionally protected right? We could have this conversation all evening long. Let's talk about a right that somebody else in here appreciates. How much are you willing to give up your right, your favorite right, in order to make somebody else feel good? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Can we focus a bit on safe storage? And
Sure.
Zach, for you, how is that going to be enforced? Are police going to be knocking on people's doors to check and see if weapons are properly stored?
No, I mean, we very carefully studied other states that have very similar state storage laws. We were curious about what other states did, how they approached it. And of all things, actually, one of the best model legislations on this is Florida, a Republican state, a Second Amendment state, and they have really strong, interesting storage laws. It's actually not based on a prescription about how you store your weapons, but it tells you that you can decide how to, and then you're responsible for what happens for them. This is a pretty basic standard, and really any responsible gun owner knows that they need to store their weapons safely, and we just believe that we ought to hold them to that standard, and that there will be consequences if they don't. And to be clear, we've already had this here. In Marysville, the young man that went to his high school and committed that atrocity had gotten easy access to his father's weapon because it was left out. And this happens quite often, very frequently. The other side of safe storage, of course, is suicide. And we know that this happens all too often where there is an easy to access gun left out when someone's in distress and they get access to it. So our hope is that we provide a new standard in which people believe and understand that that there are consequences if these things get into dangerous hands. And no, there is no police force that will be enforcing this. This is about making sure that we set a standard of expectations of what you'll do, and then there'll be consequences if you've been derelict.
I'm glad you brought up the topic of suicide, because if it's true that no police officers are going to be knocking on people's doors, don't you believe there are some steps that could be taken to make storage, this awful thing that happens over and over again with unsafe storage, to protect, children and people who are contemplating suicide?
Well, I don't know. Somebody's going to have to define what they think safe storage is. I know a lot of people in Eastern Washington.
Attempts to do that. So, but you don't like that. What kind of safe storage do you think we could do?
Well, I don't know. For example, I've got some firearms stored in a locked cabinet. I've got some firearms stored in a locked safe, or 2 or 3 locked safes. I know people in Eastern Washington who think that when they lock the door of their home and their rifle is down, say on a rifle rack or cased unloaded in a closet, that's safe storage, because who's going to belong in their house? People who break into your house don't belong there. That's, to them, safe storage. And we're talking about a cultural thing here too. And frankly, I was over in Eastern Washington the other day, and we're not very popular over there. The Seattle people just, the idea of this initiative is not terribly popular anywhere east of the summit. And I think the people who advocate a thing like this, they've got to understand that there's a different culture over there, and a different culture among firearms owners, people who've grown up with them, that they don't think and worry about guns like some folks here do.
The reality is, I just want to be really clear, many people who are involved in this are firearms owners and grew up in gun culture, including me. I grew up in rural America. I grew up around guns. I was very happy to shoot guns. I'm pretty sure, although I can't totally confirm it, that I took an NRA marksmanship course when I was young, and I took my hunter safety classes. Actually, one of the reasons I do this work is because the gun culture that I grew up in, which was a culture of responsibility, was an incredible culture where I felt proud to be a gun owner and to be somebody who used firearms, is no longer reflected in the culture we have today. And we are trying to set standards for everyone for us to live up to. And I think gun owners will be proud of those standards. They live by them every day. But the problem is, of course, we have a culture today in which they're easily accessible by people that do not follow these really norms of behavior inside the gun community. And when you don't have that, you set up laws that set high standards for people. And that's what we're doing.
Without getting too gun wonky here, can you talk a little bit about what counts as a semi-automatic assault rifle and why that's one of your concerns?
Well, there's no such thing as a semi-automatic assault rifle. They don't exist. They've never existed. An assault rifle is a selective fire weapon designed for the military. You can either fire single shots out of it or multiple shots with one squeeze of the trigger. What we've got out there in circulation now is a civilian version of the old AR-15 as it's come up through the years and been developed. It operates just like Grandpa's old A5 shotgun. One squeeze of the trigger, one round out of the gun. It's not an assault rifle. In fact, the military won't use them because they are only a semi-automatic rifle. what I think disturbs a lot of the people in the gun community, people I talk to almost every day and write for, is that, again, as I mentioned earlier, the definition that's of an assault rifle in this initiative encompasses every semi-automatic rifle that's ever been made. A .22 rifle, the Ruger 10/22, most popular .22 rifle in the country. The Marlin Model 60, the old Winchesters, the Browning SA-22 that you see them all the time at county fairs, at shooting galleries. Those guns now become suddenly assault rifles under the definition that's in this initiative, and that's really going too far.
All right, thank you. We have been talking with Zach Silk and Dave Workman about Initiative 1639, the gun safety measure. Hang on to your seats. We're coming right back to talk about sweetened beverage taxes. Thank you. And we are back to discuss Initiative 1634. This measure would ban potential local taxes on food and sweetened beverages. Seattle has a sweetened beverage tax, and the industry is not happy about it. Our guests are Brandon Hersey, Federal Way teacher, who favors Initiative 1634, and State Senator Reuven Carlyle of Seattle, who is no fan of this measure. Brandon, we start with you. Please give us a quick explanation of what Initiative 1634 is and why we need it.
Well, absolutely. Well, first off, thank you so much for having me here tonight. I am so excited to have this conversation with you, especially on a school night, because I don't have to grade any papers. But my name is Brandon Hersey, like the candy bar without the second H, for those of you who might be wondering. And I am a teacher down in Federal Way, but I'm a resident here in Seattle, and I am here tonight in favor of 1634, which would prevent local governments from taxing groceries. Now, what is clear and what I would like to note is that 1634 has no effect on Seattle's soda tax. In fact, this is much bigger than soda. This is much bigger than Seattle. This is about having an equitable conversation about making this state more affordable for the most vulnerable people living in this state. And I am here speaking on behalf of my students and the families that I work with every day who are struggling to make ends meet.
Senator Carlyle, what's wrong with Initiative 1634?
Well, thank you as well. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with everyone tonight. Look, 1634 is the most egregious initiative in a generation. It's an abuse of the initiative process, and it's a made-up political narrative from Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and Dr. Pepper. And that's why they're on target to spend $20 million to make sure that no more cities outside of Seattle can move forward with a soda tax. We have to acknowledge the fact that this initiative makes Tim Eyman look like a teddy bear fight. This is a national movement to prohibit local soda taxes around the country. They're introducing legislation in virtually every state, and they're doing initiatives in the rest of them. So that's what this is really about, and look forward to the conversation.
So we have to clear up something here about the use of the word groceries, and this is to you, Senator. Groceries are used in the ads and in the initiative. There is some footwork here on this kind of wording. Why is this so confusing?
The reason it's confusing is that Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and Dr. Pepper have done hundreds of thousands of dollars of marketing research, and the word groceries tests at about 80 to 90%, and the word soda pop tests at about 10 to 20%. So the fact of the matter is that it's politically popular to pretend like there's a threat that there's going to be grocery taxes. Does anybody here to pay grocery taxes in Washington State? Well, it's been illegal since 1977. So what this is about is soda taxes. And what this is about is stopping the momentum of progressive cities like Seattle, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, other cities around the country from moving forward with soda taxes, despite the fact that it's the recommendation of the World Health Organization, and countries around the world are implementing soda taxes to invest in childhood nutrition.
Can I respond really quickly to that?
Yeah,
I think that it's incredibly short-sighted to think that these talking points focusing in on big soda have anything to do with the lived experiences of the students in my classroom, the Boy Scouts that I mentor every week, and the people of color in marginalized communities who are living in one of the most regressively taxed states in this nation, and to think that we are focusing in this important conversation and limiting it to the discussion of who is funding this initiative rather than the people who are struggling. I have students in my classroom this year who are experiencing poverty, who experience hunger, who are experiencing so many other things that I shudder to think about if I went through when I was a child. And that is because we are willing to tax basic necessities like groceries. This is not just about soda. This is preventing local municipalities and local governments from taxing things like meat, poultry, and other things that we would all find essential.
Well, in 1977, the people of this state outlawed taxation on meat and poultry and other food.
And I'd like to speak to that point as well. They outlawed a sales tax.
Absolutely. And since 1977,
does the soda tax
can I just
implement sales tax?
Brandon, hang on a second.
If I could, just for a second.
Sure,
Since 1977, sales taxes on groceries in Washington state have been illegal. For 41 years, there has not been one bill introduced in the Washington state legislature, and there's about 3,000 bills a year introduced. There's not been one public initiative to tax what human beings would traditionally call food. There have been proposals to tax soda. And that's what this is about. It is about soda. And the fact is, there is no political risk, there is no policy risk, and there is no reality on the front lines of any taxation of groceries. It's a made-up political problem designed by soda in order to prohibit soda taxes.
Brandon, so why are groceries included? Explain it to us.
Absolutely.
This is clearly a hot
topic.
The
tax that the senator would have you believe, or the measure, rather the law that the senator would have you believe, is that there is not the ability in Washington state currently to place a sales tax on groceries. However, there is a loophole in the law that has been affirmed by the Attorney General's office that you can place a tax on distributors. What's to stop another municipality or local government from placing that same tax on distributors? And to be clear, those distributors pass that tax down to the consumer.
Well,
so how do you reconcile that?
Isn't that sort of a straw man argument, the fear that something could happen but hasn't?
It's not a straw man argument in the sense that it's happened right now. They've exploited this loophole. The soda tax exists. And what's to say that that doesn't happen in a place like Federal Way? What's to say that doesn't happen like in a place like Spokane? What's to say that that doesn't happen and continuously puts a student or a young person or a marginalized person in a position to where they have even less of what are considered to be incredibly finite resources in this state. And we are coming from a place of privilege even having this discussion. I'm really, really saddened by the fact that we're limiting and conflating this argument to be about soda when this is truly and unequivocally about preventing local governments from taxing groceries.
If it's not about soda, why not leave soda out of the initiative then?
It's not about soda in the sense that, that's a really good question. I'm not, right. So I'm a teacher. I am not the policymaker, and I'm not speaking here on behalf of Big Soda. I'm not speaking here on behalf of anyone but my students and the families that I work for every day, right? I think that what the key point here is whether soda is left in the initiative or not, that the takeaway is that with Washington State's regressive tax structure, there have got to be better ways to solve these huge problems that so many families are experiencing, rather than taxing the most vulnerable people in order to fund local programs. I think that there have to be better ways.
So let's talk a little bit about justice, and I appreciate going to the core of that issue. African Americans in this country are 50% more likely to be obese. 2/3 of the people in this country are overweight. The World Health Organization is fanatical about the direct nexus the direct cause of soda pop to obesity to poor public health. Type 2 diabetes, hypertension, extraordinarily poor health outcomes, low-income communities of color. There is a dramatic and a real and an academically valid peer-reviewed proof that the soda companies have disproportionate advertising targeted at communities of color. Targeted at communities of color. So let's talk about the fact for just a second that 98% of the money in this initiative, they're on track to spend $20 million. $20 million they're on track to spend. They've got $13 million so far. Of that money, it is 98% from these three companies. And I would say that 37% of African American youth in this country drink 3 or more soda pops a day. This is the sugar content of 3 or more a day. 22% of Hispanic youth, 3 or more a day. This is 450% of the daily recommended. Obesity is a national and international crisis. It is real. Local governments are the only entity that the soda industry doesn't have political control of. In the state legislature, we're lucky to pass a bill declaring it anti-soda month. I mean, it's not going to happen. Congress is in the pocket of the soda industry. They're one of the largest political donors in this entire country. Local progressive cities are the only entity. And where this proposal comes from is pinpointed to 1972. It comes from a company called RJR Nabisco. It was designed by the cigarette industry, and the real reason we're here tonight and having this dialogue and talking about up to $20 million is the fact that the cigarette industry created the model and that soda is modeling this preemption legislation on. That's why we're here.
Before we move on, I just want to say that I find it incredibly misleading and offensive as a African-American person having this conversation with you. I come from one of the poorest states in this country. I grew up in Mississippi, where resources are as scarce as you could imagine. And moving here, I have seen more poverty in Federal Way, more poverty across the mountains than I ever saw in Mississippi. And you know, those sociological impacts of what poverty does in this state. We have one of the most prosperous states in this union. We have one of the wealthiest states in this country. But yet, we rank below Mississippi in closing the opportunity gap for our students simply because the wage and wealth disparities for communities of color and their counterparts are so large. If you want to have a conversation, a patriarchal conversation at that, about what is more important and what is healthy to put in a person's body, I would argue that it's more important to think about what can we do to think more creatively about helping these communities without taxing these communities. What can we do to think more creatively about not perpetuating and propagating a regressive tax structure that leaves the most vulnerable communities in this state paying more?
They're going to throw me out of here if I don't go to Natalie Brandon and a question on Twitter.
I'm just wondering, and I'd like to hear from both of you, what can we glean so far from Seattle's recently passed soda tax?
Absolutely. What we can glean so far is that we raised an exponential amount more money than we expected. We are on track to raise about 10.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing if we raised more? We
I
raised
think
more,
that it's
meaning people are paying the tax.
Right. Well, when you reconcile that with the idea that this disproportionately affects people of color and low-income communities, we're raising this tax on the backs of the people that we're aiming to help. So how do you reconcile that?
Well, actually, quite easily, because the fact of the matter is that under the leadership of Tim Burgess and the city, the folks who
Tim Burgess is here?
Is here.
Yeah,
under the leadership. The real issue is not just the tax side, but what are we doing with the money? Yes, this has raised money. It is going to some of the most innovative childhood nutrition programs and early learning for the youngest, most vulnerable students and young people in this city.
But you're taxing their families in order to pay for that?
Yes, because just
so you are taxing.
We are taxing everybody because it is a discretionary item. Soda pop is a discretionary item, and the fact of the matter is it is a direct causational relationship with obesity that has disproportionate impacts on communities of color. So the use of the money, so the use of the money really matters, and we're spending it wisely on childhood nutrition, early learning, and high-value programs that are making a profound impact statewide.
And Natalie.
I do have a Twitter question from Pat Rhodes. He asked, does I-1634 define what can or cannot be taxed?
No. Groceries in all forms are off the table with I-1634. We just believe that essentials like meat, poultry, things that we all consume and find to be healthy are not available to be taxed.
Under the initiative in 1977, soda pop was exclusively left out, so it could be taxed. We do have a syrup tax in the state of Washington that we actually do at the statewide level, but because the state legislature is so generous with tax breaks, we actually give the money back to the industry. So we tax them and then we give it right back to them. So the fact of the matter is that what this really does is it's actually a reverse loophole. It actually closes the loophole so that we can no longer tax soda, and it has nothing to do with meat, nothing to do with poultry or anything like that. Those are already eliminated.
It's known in state law as the privilege tax and has to do with distribution. So is there a way to guarantee that groceries could not be subject to a privilege tax as state law is currently written?
Well, of course. But
is there a law to do that? Or is there an initiative
we could pass
to
that
do
in.
that?
I would suggest that bill would pass the legislature. It might take about 7-8 minutes to get that passed. Very easy to do. The fact is, this is a model bill. This has nothing to do with this perceived loophole. This is a model bill that's being introduced in states all over the country. There's an initiative in Oregon to do it right now. This is designed by the American Legislative Exchange Council and companies, the soda industry nationwide, to stop local progressive cities from taxing.
Brandon, I do want to get into the nationwide part of this because, as the senator said, there's an initiative on the ballot in Oregon. California Governor Jerry Brown struck a deal to avoid something like this. And so, what is the expanse of this nationwide?
You know, I would love to have that conversation, but I don't get paid to do that type of research. I'm a teacher, right? I have an expectation to show up and teach my second graders math and reading tomorrow. I think if you have that type of question, you should ask the campaign or even ask Senator Carlyle. But I think what's more important here is that I'm focused on Washington State. I'm focused on Federal Way. I'm focused on the other cities that stand to lose the most if this measure does not pass. And I wholeheartedly believe that I-1634 is a step in the right direction in ending a regressive tax structure that the senator is supporting.
Well, I would just suggest, as the former chair of the Finance Committee, I know a little bit about taxes, and I would suggest that every time we tried to introduce any type of progressive taxes, that Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and Dr. Pepper were among the leading companies opposing any type of progressive tax reform in the state of Washington. And that's been approved, in fact, for the past 20 years. I would just note, if I could for just a second, that I think it's important to recognize that we are here in the end because since 2003, for 15 years in a row, Coca-Cola Company has formally submitted to the Securities and Exchange Commission filings which says that the #1 risk to their revenues is the association of their product with obesity. The #1 threat to their revenues. We are here because soda is extremely price elastic. So as the price goes up, people stop buying. You've seen a dramatic reduction in England, in France, in Colombia, in Mexico, 12%, countries all over the world. And it's the same thing in the United States. And that's what Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and Dr. Pepper are so terrified about. And that's why they're willing to spend $20 million in Washington State. And as for your comment, which I appreciate you being here with absolute due respect, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, and Dr. Pepper have 364,000 employees. The fact that they couldn't make one available to debate their $20 million initiative is a disappointment, I think, to the people of Washington.
Because this is not about soda. I don't know how many times we have to I don't know how many times we have to go back over this. This is about groceries. And it's...
I have a question to get to.
Sure,
Excuse me.
absolutely.
Sarah Toomey has a question on Twitter, and this will be for Senator Carlyle. Is there evidence that soda taxes are effective in terms of health outcomes? do they disproportionately impact poor and minority communities?
Yeah, that's a fabulous question. How you spend the money matters. The investment of those dollars in childhood nutrition, which is the formal recommendation of the World Health Organization. So how you spend the money matters. And then the prices,
And
the
just
price
to be clear,
elasticity.
though, that would be up to individual cities.
Correct.
And local jurisdictions.
Correct. How those dollars are spent really matters, and I think it makes sense for those local communities to make those decisions themselves.
But you didn't answer the piece about disproportionately affecting communities of color.
This is a product, just like tobacco, that I think we have to exercise great caution in artificially lowering the price that doesn't capture the true cost to health, to society, and to communities. This product is cheap today because the federal government subsidizes with corn subsidies to $20 billion a year. The number one of the largest ingredients in soda pop is artificially low because of federal crop subsidies. So it's not just about our little corner of the world in Seattle. This is about geopolitics of the soda industry and their political power.
Senator, I got to bring in an audience question. Hello, hi.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us.
Yes, my name is Martha Burke. My question is, in the city of Seattle, who is most affected by this in terms of the stores? What I wonder is if this is more affecting like the small grocery stores, like, owned by immigrants, like the local bodegas and the 7-Elevens, and how do we account for that?
I can speak to that. So let me kind of break this down. The Seattle soda tax is a tax on distributors, right? And it hits not only major corporations like Safeway, who can eat that tax, but also those mom and pop grocery stores that can't. So as a result, they have to raise their prices and then pass those prices in those tax pieces onto the consumer, which are largely people of color and low-income communities. Now, the difference there is that if we have a big problem with major corporations having a stake in politics, we're really not really being as equitable to both small business owners who are losing customers and some of the most marginalized people in this state.
Hey, Brandon, when we met, you told me that you don't drink soda pop. How come?
Well, I don't really know what that has to do with this conversation.
Because we're talking about soda pop.
Well, I'm not talking about soda pop. I'm talking about groceries.
Well, a whole bunch of folks here are talking about soda pop, so I'd like you to answer that question.
Well, I think that it's, frankly, to me, a little sad that we're wasting time in this conversation about what I personally choose to put in my body, especially when there are so many hungry children across Washington state. But to answer your question, I don't drink soda because, frankly, I don't like to drink sweet things at all. And I actually read a Facebook post the other day that said that because I like bitter things like black coffee, IPA, and rare meat, I might be a sociopath. So.
Okay. One last audience question. We're running out of time. Real quickly, and say who your question's for. Tight question.
My question is for the senator. It seems like those that are for this initiative are assuming that it will be applied to more than beverages. Is there any evidence or even some other kind of thing that says that Seattle will actually be doing that? Do you know of any reason? Is Seattle going to do that? And if not, it seems like the people who are voting yes for this should know that it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to move on to meats and other things.
Yeah, thank you. It's a made-up political problem. If it wasn't, the word groceries is popular. If it wasn't this issue, it would be something else. The fact of the matter is the cost, according to the National Council of State Legislators, for taxpayers in Washington state to deal with the problem of obesity is $2.9 billion a year. And the fact of the matter is that cost is being borne by taxpayers and by society. What we're trying to do in standing up for the right of local cities to have authority is the ability to recognize that we need to capture those costs. And instead of the taxpayer paying for it, let's try to embed that cost in this product. And let's try to be much smarter about this as a society.
Thank you both. We have been talking loudly with Brandon Hersey and State Senator Reuven Carlyle. Next up, putting a price on carbon. And we are back to talk about Initiative 1631, a measure that would impose a carbon pollution fee. Speaking for the measure is former State Representative Brady Walkinshaw. Against, Dana Bieber, spokeswoman for No on Initiative 1631. You know the drill here, Brady. What is this initiative? Why do we need it?
Totally. Well, thanks for having me. Great to be here. Thanks to Seattle Channel. Thanks to everyone who's here. I was really excited by the invitation to get to talk about this. So what we're here to talk about is Initiative 1631, which would put a fee on the state's largest polluters to raise about $1 billion to invest those resources in future generations in our state in clean energy and natural resources. And what that does, I mean, for me personally, I grew up in Washington State, and one side of my family immigrated here from Cuba. We're going to talk about how this impacts immigrant communities in our state. The other side of my family's fifth generation Washingtonian, has been working on conservation in Washington State for 5 generations. And what we have in front of us right now is an opportunity to take what the state legislature passed in 2008. So in 2008, the state legislature passed carbon emissions targets, which said that we need to reduce emissions in Washington State by 25% below 1990 levels by 2035. And it may not come as a surprise to you that we are well behind that pathway. And to get on that pathway, an initiative like this is a sensible approach built by the broadest coalition in state history: health advocates, small business, children's advocates, small businesses, again, more small businesses actually, environmentalists, broad coalition that's brought this to the ballot. This is a really exciting measure in Washington State. It's a chance for us to invest in clean energy jobs. It's a chance for us in Washington State to invest in the health and well-being of future generations. And ultimately, and this is what it comes down to, this we're going to talk about tonight, is ultimately it comes down to being able to hold the largest polluters in this country, which, by the way, my colleague here, who I met and I quite like, but my colleague who I just met earns tens of thousands of dollars representing major oil companies from Texas, $25 million into the state on this campaign from the opposition, big oil. And that is going against the health of future generations and conservation in Washington State. So that's what this initiative's about, and I can't wait to talk about it. So thanks for having me.
Dana Bieber, you represent industry. What's so bad about reducing carbon emissions?
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I appreciate City Club, and Brady, thank you for being here too, and to have this important conversation with voters. So the trouble with 1631 and why our coalition of over 154,000 Washington families and farmers and consumers and small businesses have come together to urge a no vote, it's because it's a misleading and ineffective and costly proposal. And let me explain what I mean by that. You know, 1631, the proponents say they're going to go after the largest polluters in the state of Washington. But what they don't tell you is they actually exempted 8 out of the 12 largest carbon emitters in the state, get a special exemption, and won't have to pay the fees and tax under 1631. So then who does pay the cost? That gets pushed down to Washington families and small businesses and consumers in the form of higher prices for our basic necessities. The cost of gasoline would increase. The cost of utilities would increase. The Washington Policy Center took a look at this and said the average Washington family in the first year alone would pay an additional $300 a year in increased costs. And it's important to note this is a permanent escalating tax that would go up each and every year. So you can see how hundreds of dollars a year for families could quickly turn into thousands of dollars a year. And what do we get for this? That's one of the fundamental flaws. We don't know. 1631 is so poorly written that we don't know what we get. We don't know how this money will be spent. And instead, it's spent by an unelected board of political appointees who can spend the money in pretty much any way they want. And there's no assurances written into 1631, or a requirement even, that the carbon emissions would be reduced. And that's why we believe it's a bad policy and we're urging a no vote.
So from the top, why were those large polluters left out? I think people need to know that.
So you're going to hear 3 disingenuous arguments here. The first disingenuous argument you're going to hear is that this passes on a fee to consumers in this state. If big oil companies that are backing this initiative could pass that fee on to consumers in this state, which, by the way, has not happened with other forms of fees on fuel emissions in this country. If they were to be able to do that, they wouldn't be spending $25 million in this initiative. So that's the first thing. You're not going to see the degree of fees that are being spoken about by my colleague here passed on to consumers. The second disingenuous argument that's being made and being spread actually by the campaign is this idea of accountability. And that's wrong for a couple reasons. The way the initiative works is that it's raising $1 billion through a $15 per metric ton price on carbon. And those fees are being the revenue, that $1 billion generated by that, it's going to be governed by a 15-member board of scientists, of policymakers, of health and business advocates. Unfortunately, not big oil. But it will be governed by that board. They will propose how those funds are going to be spent, and that'll go to the state legislature for authorization. So it's accountable directly to the elected officials, like Senator Carlyle, who was just here, accountable right to the elected officials who are actually designing and developing the use of those funds. So that's the second thing. The third thing that's disingenuous about this argument is exemptions. And this goes to your question, Joni. What's disingenuous about the exemptions argument, sorry, I had to just unpack it a little bit. What's disingenuous about the exemptions argument, because it's so important. What's disingenuous about the exemptions argument is that it basically says the argument that the companies that are being exempted here are groups like TransAlta, which is actually it's actually a good example. It's actually a coal producer in the state that is being worked on actually through legislative authorization to work to transitioning off coal and actually on to hopefully solar farming in the state, which is right where we should be going. So the exemptions that are worked into the initiative are actually ones where we're trying to work with companies that are either competing on global markets, right? Competing on global markets where we don't want to cut jobs, or it's where we're actually working to create a clean energy future. So the exemptions are actually pro-job, pro-clean energy.
I'm simply stating the facts. And the facts are that 8 out of the 12 largest polluters in the state are exempt from 1631. But of course, small businesses and families are not. And that's one of the troubling aspects about it. That's one of the reasons, people like Dr. Cliff Mass from the University of Washington, who's absolutely passionate about finding a solution for climate change, is urging a no vote on this measure because he doesn't believe it's effective. The other thing I want to talk about are the costs. It is absolutely wishful thinking to say you're going to increase taxes by $2.3 billion and there'll simply be no cost to consumers, because that's certainly not what the governor said. Governor Jay Inslee admitted, yeah, the cost of gasoline is going to go up about 13 cents a gallon.
I really want to be clear here that when we're done talking, I suppose, are gas prices going to go up, and how are poor folks, communities of color, going to be able to absorb those gas increases?
Do you want to go to that first?
I'll start with it. Independent studies have said that the cost of gasoline will increase by about 14 cents a gallon the first year alone. And remember, this goes up each and every year. There is also additional cost for utilities. This week, Puget Sound Energy issued a statement and said, in fact, yes, ratepayers need to know that the cost of your utilities will go up. These are regressive taxes. These most impact those who can at least afford to pay more for basic necessities. We all need to drive to work. We all need to heat our homes. We all need to cook our food. Those are the costs that would go up each and every year. And it starts out at $2.3 billion in the first 5 years. But because this escalates, in 15 years, this will be a $30 billion energy tax.
So I'm just going to say for the record, I don't agree with those figures that you've put out. But what I will say is the number that has been discussed is that what this would look, it will impact. There will be an impact, and I think the campaign has talked about a figure of about $10 a month per household in Washington State. So that's kind of the figure that we're talking about. But if you then look at the $1 billion that's being generated in revenue, a lot of those resources are actually going to help with tax relief to some of the households who have least in this state. So let's talk about the uses of those. Can I talk about the uses of those funds?
Sure.
Or do you want to?
Yeah.
So just to talk about the uses of those funds, because my colleague here brought up the term regressive, and I just want to reflect on that for a sec. What's regressive is when we don't meet the Paris Climate Accords. What's regressive in this country, and in the state, we'll get to the state, what's regressive in this country is when we fail to transition this country at the speed to clean energy opportunities for jobs. And what's regressive in this country is when brown and black kids in this country have asthma rates at multiples times higher than white kids. And what we're seeing with this initiative is investments that are coming out of the 70% of that billion is going to be invested back into working on clean energy production and opportunities in Washington state. Investment back into things like forest health so that we are able to invest in the forest management practices that are going to avert the fact that what also is aggressive, by the way, is air pollution. What's aggressive about air pollution being created by cities like Yakima in the state saw 48 days where air quality levels hit dangerous standards. And this initiative is going to invest back into the forest management practices through groups like the Department of Natural Resources in this state, who are going to be able to manage our forests in ways that we actually bring down those air quality pollution. And it's hard to talk about this without mentioning the orca whales, because we have to talk about our orcas. And the reality is that we have been polluting the Puget Sound. And if we do not look at restoring salmon populations that are actually going to be feeding the orcas in this state, we are also going to be able to use funds from this $1 billion to invest in pollution prevention programs. So the impacts of not raising that money actually directly are regressive for the health impacts of kids and families in this state.
You know, the troubling thing about this measure, in addition to the cost increases for families and farmers and small businesses, is that we don't know what we get. This measure is so poorly written, it doesn't have a specific spending plan. It's like the measure is written such that it says, well, just give us the money, we'll figure out how to spend it, trust us. There's no specified spending plan, and there's actually no requirement that despite spending all this money, that carbon emissions would actually have to be reduced. And in fact, they incentivize themselves for failure, because if the 15-member board isn't successful at reducing carbon emissions, and it will be a challenge to do when you exempt 8 out of the 12 largest polluters, you know what they get? More money. That's reasons why the Washington State Farm Bureau, for example, is urging a no vote. You know, they represent 45,000 farmers in the state of Washington. Most of these are small family farmers. They care about climate change and climate policy. It's important to our state, and yet groups like that are urging a no vote because it doesn't have the accountability and requirements for success that we as voters deserve.
Yeah, I think you're being a little confused with numbers here.
No, I think
this is actually going to be covering 80% of emissions in Washington state. So 80% of total emissions of companies producing 80% of emissions are covered under this initiative. So the other point I just want to bring up, kind of along those lines, is the reality that as we look at where the resources from this are going, the resources from this are accountable. I mean, what you see here is a governing board that's modeled on very similar things like the Workforce Development Board that we have in Washington state, which is very similarly restructured. You have 15 members appointed by elected public officials who propose spending plans that then go to the legislature for authorization. This isn't rocket science. I mean, it's a pretty consistent and tested way of raising and then using public funds.
This is actually doesn't have the accountability. These are political appointees on this board, and they don't have the legislative oversight that other boards may have. They are appointed by the governor, and they can spend the money however they choose. In fact, there's no checks and balances, and there's not the conflicts of interest, the protections that there should be. This member board can actually funnel the money to their own communities, to their own pet project, to their own organizations. And that's what we're talking about. That's why our former state auditor, Democrat Brian Sontag, is urging a no vote on 1631, because he says it lacks accountability to voters.
I hear Essex Porter coming in here.
Yeah, a question first about the exemptions. Brady, I think a lot of people would understand why the coal plant is being exempt. It's going to stop using coal in 5 years. But what about the other companies? Why do they get an exemption?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the main driver behind the other exemptions that have been agreed upon and written into this initiative, it's a set of companies that are competing on global markets that for very specific reasons either have plans to move toward clean energy futures, or for specific reasons, it makes sense based on global markets for those decisions to be made. So that's the framing I would say about the 8-12. But the data point I would come back to, Essex, is this covers 80% of emissions in this state. So it's covering the vast majority of emissions. It's covering 100 of the state's largest polluters. And it's raising $1 billion from those 100 largest polluters in this state on a $15 per metric ton tax on or fee on carbon, and that's where those resources are being raised. And I worry with this initiative a bit that in this discussion, you kind of have this conversation about some of these details, for instance, about exemptions, for instance. The reality is that by pushing forward this step, where the vast majority of major polluters, who are oil companies and specific utilities that haven't fully transitioned onto clean energy, are paying a fee, and that fee is being reinvested in communities.
Essex, may I get in there real quick and just make one quick point about that? The proponents like to say 80% is covered, but they've never backed that up. And in fact, when the Seattle Times took a look at this, they recently reported that it appears to be less than 60%. So that's according to the Seattle Times, and it makes sense when you exempt 8 out of the 12 largest polluters. And it's not just that, it's possibly hundreds of other large corporate polluters that get exempt, but then small businesses and Washington families don't.
I gotta go to the Twitterverse, Natalie.
I think we're still waiting for Twitter questions to come in, but I have a question, and this is for you, Brady. We know that Canada imposed a carbon fee several years ago, but an article by the Vancouver Sun said British Columbia's carbon emissions have fallen by only 2% since 2007, under expectations. So what is there a guarantee that that won't happen here? How are we measuring impact?
So the pushback on that, the comment I would make there, Natalie, is that is in the face of Canadian emissions going up 15 to 20%. So you saw British Columbia actually reducing its emissions, even if it was just in that figure, against Canada writ large seeing a significant increase in their emissions. So the positive outcomes of that actually were significant emissions reductions, especially based on what you saw across the rest of Canada.
I have an audience question. Hi, how you doing?
Hi, thank you. So this summer with all the wildfire smoke, I've got 2 young kids, and I had to interrupt my work to take them home from a summer camp that was outside because I was worried about their health. And so health for children is a really important thing to me, and thinking about how to decide on a policy that's going to impact them so much. I want to know more about which side really to trust. This is a complicated issue. And so I was hoping that you could both tell me a little bit more about who are your main proponents and donors.
Thank you. I'd be happy to answer the question. I understand your question and your concern as a mother. I have 3 children myself, and so I know what you're facing. And I think as a parent, I think we can all agree it's our responsibility to preserve and protect our environment. And that is where 1631 is uniquely frustrating, because it doesn't do what the proponents claim it's going to do. And it kind of goes back to Natalie's question there. There's nothing in 1631 that will actually give a guarantee or even an assurance that despite spending billions upon billions of dollars, that carbon emissions would be reduced. So to the second part of your question, though, you asked about who's part of our coalition. We represent over 154,000 Washington families and small businesses. It's organizations like the Washington Farm Bureau, the King and Pierce County Farm Bureau, the Washington Retail Association. Labor unions are urging a no vote. You know, the iron workers, the laborers, the building trades. Labor unions have joined with business coalitions, farmers from across the state, all urging a no vote, because we believe that this is an ineffective and costly measure.
I think she also asked who are the major funders of your initiative.
The funders shouldn't be any surprise. I know the proponents like to bring it up quite a bit. It shouldn't be any surprise that energy companies are supporting our coalition.
Like
because
who?
after you exempt the all the other large polluters, and you leave energy companies and their customers on the hook to pay the additional costs. It shouldn't be any surprise. But you know, Washington voters are smart. And when they talk about money, they talk about the money that measures like this would cost them. It's undeniable that the increased costs of gasoline, electricity, natural gas will all be paid by Washington families and consumers. So when we talk about money, I think that's the critical issue to voters.
So,
audience.
I don't feel like you answered the question about the main donors, though. Could you be more specific?
I'd be happy to. And the nice thing about Washington State is all the donors are public knowledge on the public disclosure website. So you can go there and you can find out exactly every dollar that comes in and every dollar that comes out.
Yeah.
They are the large energy companies like BP, which is based out of Whatcom County. It's the other energy companies that employ tens of thousands of people in the state of Washington and contribute to our local economy. And again, they were the ones who didn't get the special exemption that the other companies got.
Can Can I answer that question too? Or you can go ahead.
No, you go.
Okay.
You go. It's like a four-way stop in Seattle. Go for
it. To your question, I think this is the crux of it. I mean, for decades, you've seen major oil companies trying to make policy that would arguably prevent pollution. And the reality is we're seeing this happen again in Washington State, just with a different flavor. And what you're seeing is the most expensive, the largest investment ever in Washington State ballot initiative history, going into trying to prevent what is an appropriate, modest, and acceptable price on carbon, driven by the broadest coalition campaign in our history. So children's advocates who are looking out for the health of kids, a vast number of labor unions.
But speaking of the history, there was a carbon measure on the Washington State ballot a couple years ago, and it failed. So why is this one any better or any different?
So that, just to shift to that question, so what we've seen here is what happened in 2016 in this state. It was an important effort to bring a lot of voters out to educate people on the importance of voting around carbon. And I saw so many people out in neighborhoods knocking on behalf of that initiative. This builds on that, and it builds on a lot of other coalition building efforts that's happened in the state. And I would actually say that 2018, going into this year, we've actually experienced some of the worst wildfire seasons we've ever seen. We've actually experienced and lived through some of the biggest impacts of climate change that we've seen in our own lives in Washington State. So I think you see an urgency of this moment. I think you see some lessons, and I think you see the broadest coalition we've had.
A question about who ends up paying. You know, as consumers, we see the price of gasoline going up and down on a whim. We have no clue why it goes up and down. So why would the companies that produce gasoline have to pass the entire cost of the fee on to the consumers? They raise and lower the price of gas on a whim anyway.
Well, you know, when you talk about increasing the cost by $2.3 billion in the first 5 years alone, it's wishful thinking to think that the companies are going to just absorb that cost.
But they could.
Those costs get pushed down to consumers in the form of higher prices for gasoline. I mean, the governor has also admitted that the price will increase. Puget Sound Energy just this week said, yes, in fact, the cost of utilities will increase. And this acts like a regressive energy tax that puts the burden on those who can least afford to pay more.
So and quickly for Brady, if I might, for Brady,
good.
You talk about all kinds of programs that would somehow assist low-income people. Do low-income people actually get any kind of cash rebate from this?
There's not a cash rebate. What you see in this is you do see relief. So there are programs that help with efficiency standards for low-income communities. So
you might get your house insulated, but you're not going to get some cash that help you pay for the gasoline that's now more expensive.
There's tax relief, but there's not a direct cash payment. So if you look at where
how do people experience that relief? And
it's coming through a variety of programs that are supporting kind of low-income communities and communities of color in the state.
But that's not the kind of thing that supports a worker who has to drive 50 miles round trip to a job site. That they have to pay the increased costs in gasoline. That's one of the reasons you're going to find many labor unions urging a no vote because of the cost and the regressive nature of this.
So we got to go. So much more to say. We have been discussing the Carbon Initiative 1631 with Brady Walkinshaw and Dana Bieber. Civic Cocktail will be back next month. Thanks so much for watching.